Chapter 14, Classification of Infectious Diseases and Epidemiology of Infectious Diseases. The learning objectives for this topic are: describe the basis for each of the various classification schemes of infectious diseases, distinguish among acute, subacute, chronic, and latent diseases, distinguish among communicable, contagious, and non-communicable infectious disease, define epidemiology, contrast incidence and prevalence, differentiate among the terms endemic, sporadic, epidemic, and pandemic, explain three approaches epidemiologists use to study diseases and populations, explain how nosocomial infections differ from other infections, describe the factors that influence the development of nosocomial infections, describe three types of nosocomial infections and how they may be prevented, list three ways public health agencies work to limit the spread of diseases. An overview of this topic is: we're going to cover classification of infectious diseases, general epidemiology, frequency of disease, epidemiological studies, hospital epidemiology, nosocomial infections, and epidemiology and public health. First, let's go over the classification of infectious diseases. In the book, it talks about two basic ways of classifying infectious diseases. The first is by body system or body organ affected. For some diseases, this makes sense. Influenza only affects the respiratory system, so you can group it in with the other respiratory viruses. You can also say, okay, hepatitis is a disease specifically of the liver, and so on. And this is a pretty good system because it makes sense. A lot of doctors specialize in just one body system, and they get very, very good at it, so it makes sense to classify the diseases of that body system or organ based on that specialty. We run into problems with microbes, with pathogens that can't stay put. HIV is a prime example. It starts out as a disease of the lymphatics, if you want to call it that. It's infecting T cells, but then it spreads to all of the organs as the drop in immunity affects all of the organs. So it's a whole body disease. There are also other diseases that we used to think stayed in one part of the body and we're now finding that they go all over the place. For example, periodontal disease, inflammation of the gums. You would say, oh, that is a disease of the mouth, a disease of the gums, therefore it would be classed in with the gastrointestinal system. Well, we're finding periodontal disease organisms that cause periodontal disease, causing heart valve problems and hardening of the arteries and all sorts of good stuff. In other words, the pathogens that are causing inflammation of the gums are not staying there. They get into the blood system and they proceed to travel throughout the body. So we've got other systems that we usually use along with or parallel with the body system, and that would be longevity and severity. So let's take a look at some terms that are related to longevity and severity. Acute diseases are those in which the signs and symptoms appear very quickly, and usually they go away very quickly. Chronic diseases, on the other hand, are very long-lasting. Usually, the buildup of signs and symptoms happens over a long period to match the long duration of the disease. Now, subacute disease, I really should have put it between acute and chronic because it's not as bad as acute, but it's not as long-lasting as chronic, so it's, get it, subacute. Alright, latent diseases. Those are diseases that there are no signs and symptoms, and we can't isolate the pathogen from the patient in between bouts of activity of the pathogen. So, herpes is a classic example. You get the initial cold sore on your mouth, it goes away, you have no signs and symptoms. If I was to swab the spot, I wouldn't be able to isolate herpes virus. But then there's a trigger, You feel a tingle in that spot, and sure enough, another blister shows up. That would be latent diseases. Now, all of these relate to longevity and severity. We also classify them by how they're passed. Communicable diseases are those that spread from human to human. Okay? Cold virus, herpes simplex, all of these are communicable. You can catch them from another person. If they are easily passed from person to person, we call it a contagious disease. The common cold is very contagious. Not especially virulent, but it is contagious. Whereas others are less contagious. Leprosy, for all it being absolutely horrible once you get it, is not terribly contagious. You really have to work to get it. Non-communicable diseases are those diseases that are caused by microbes, but they aren't passed from human to human. They either arise from your own microbiome, your own friends that are living on you, they just get into the wrong place, or your immune system is suppressed so that they multiply beyond what they should, or it comes from outside but you still don't pass it to somebody else. Now, an example of a non-communicable disease that is caused by your own endogenous microbiome would be if you have a ruptured appendix and you develop severe sepsis because your gut bacteria got into your abdominal cavity where they shouldn't be, and it's making you very, very ill. But you can't pass that on to somebody else. Another example of a non-communicable disease, but this one coming from the outside, but you can't pass it to somebody else, would be botulism. You eat the substance where the botulism organism has been growing in its air-free environment. It's producing a toxin. You eat it, the toxin affects your nervous system, and you become ill. It's not going to be passed to somebody else through you being ill. Now, it can be passed to somebody else if they ate the same thing, but that's a different situation. Both of those are examples of non-communicable diseases. On to general epidemiology. Previously, when we were talking about how we classify diseases, we were talking about how it affects the individual. Epidemiology is the study of the impact on populations of diseases, their spread, where and when they occur, and such things. All of that is the study of epidemiology. Currently, epidemiology started out with just infectious diseases. Now it covers accidents, cigarette smoking, lead poisoning, anything that affects the health of the population. Because this is a general microbiology class, we're going to be limiting our discussion to, mainly, the epidemiology of infectious diseases, or the study of the transmission and effect of infectious diseases on populations. Part of epidemiology is measuring the incidence of a disease versus the prevalence. The incidence is the number of new cases divided by the total population over a given period of time. For example, oftentimes epidemiologists figure out the incidence of influenza during the flu season. Usually we can stop right there with acute diseases like influenza. Most of us don't have influenza for long periods of time. If you have influenza for years, you're in severe trouble. Prevalence, on the other hand, is a measurement that we use for chronic diseases. Prevalence is the number of new and existing cases divided by the total population for a given amount of time. So an example of chronic diseases using both incidence and prevalence, suppose I got TB, tuberculosis, in 1983, and my case was included in the incidence, which is the number of new cases, for 1983. But when we're looking at prevalence in 1999, we would include new cases and old cases, such as mine, if I had TB from 1983 to 1999, which unfortunately, a lot of people who have TB, it goes into latency, and they are still considered to be tuberculosis positive. This would also be the case for HIV patients. Taking the incidence data and the incidence and prevalence data for chronic diseases, we can look at the frequency of diseases over geographic areas. So let's talk about endemic disease. These are diseases that are in a given area at a standard rate, and it's considered normal. So, for example, the common cold is considered endemic throughout most of the world. We have it at a normal rate. Yeah, you see a little bit of an uptick during the winter, but pretty much you can pick up the cold any time of the year. That would be considered an endemic disease. Sporadic would be where it just shows up occasionally. A lot of our childhood diseases have become sporadic because we have vaccines that make us immune before we can ever come in contact with the pathogen. So when we have an outbreak of measles, using this map over here in the upper New York area, that would be considered a sporadic incidence. Now, if something goes above what is normal for endemic disease, it's considered an epidemic. So an example of that would be influenza. A couple of years ago when the swine flu, H1N1, broke out, it was above normal levels. It was a new type of influenza, and it was considered epidemic. Also, we consider diseases that are new to an area to be epidemic. So, for example, when West Nile virus came to the North America, started making its way from the East Coast to the West Coast, it was considered an epidemic. We hadn't had West Nile virus in North America before, and so it was considered above endemic levels because it wasn't endemic, and it was considered above sporadic levels because it was found in more than just one small localized area. A pandemic is where you have an epidemic that is on more than one continent. HIV is considered to be a pandemic. It's on every continent it's on every continent in the planet.